This episode is brought to you by Hyundai. Think you know what an electric vehicle should be? Think again. From the charge time and range in the Ioniq 5 and 6 to the 601 horsepower Ioniq 5N, Hyundai is redefining what EVs should be. Learn more about Hyundai EVs at HyundaiUSA.com. EPA estimated 303-mile driving range for 2024 Ioniq 5 SE SEL limited rear-wheel drive and 361-mile driving range for 2024 Ioniq 6 SE long-range rear-wheel drive with fully charged battery. Actual range may vary.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Today at T-Mobile, I'm joined by a special co-anchor.
What up, everybody? It's your boy, Big Snoop Deal Double G.
Snoop, where can people go to find great deals?
Head to T-Mobile.com and get 4 iPhone 16s with Apple Intelligence on us, plus 4 lines for $25.
That's quite a deal, Snoop. And when you switch to T-Mobile, you can save versus the other big guys' comparable plans plus streaming.
Respect. We up out of here.
See how you can save on wireless and streaming versus the other big guys at T-Mobile.com/switch. Apple Intelligence requires iOS 18.1 or later.
Wonder-working power in the precious...
Incredible as they seem, are not the results of mass hysteria.
You may wish to adjust the dial. You're currently tuned into
the wrong station. Spiders are a unique case in evolution. They've existed for 380 million years, contain 114 families, 3,984 genera, and around 60,000 species, with more discovered every year. And all of them, from the giant Theraphosa blondi that reach blindly across the South American jungles in search of rodents, to the Mastophora genus, which swing a sticky lasso at airborne prey. All of them are carnivores. They will eat anything they can overpower. He used to watch the news, his eyes rigid, focused, and wet, his breath coming in fits and starts, his heart pumping like a laboring machine as he considered the events in the context of his world, of history, of what his children would one day inherit. Illness, death, violence without purpose. This was not an existence that made sense to him. The cruelty was too much. He heard others lament the same things he himself despised, and yet he did not believe they truly understood the horror of it. He felt it more deeply. Tragedy that created empathy, empathy that changed nothing. Always the same. Always. Always. It made him nauseous. And then, one autumn afternoon, while out in the yard, he saw the spider, a fat orange teardrop with a dappled abdomen and 8 legs spread radially from the center of its web. It had strung the web between the posts of his covered back porch. The light, misty rain that blew through a few hours earlier had left it with a coating of water, just enough that he could see its entire geometry. A perfect shape, beauty incarnate. No painting or mosaic could accomplish this. No material in the world was so fine and delicate as to make this web. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, He stepped out of the house and stood before the spider as a man stands before an altar. He leaned in close, trying to understand his own fascination. As long as he did not breathe too harshly on the silk, the spider stayed still. It was completely absent, unaware. Its eyes were too small and atrophied by evolution to see him. Even if it could, it would not have noticed his inner pain, nor would it have cared. The spider's perception was reserved only for its web, the tiny lens with which it saw the world. The only thing that mattered was the prey that fell into it. Following one of the strong structural threads to where it anchored the web to the post, the spider had left a tiny silken cocoon there. The cocoon shook gently, although there was no breeze. He leaned closer. The side was split like a half-opened eyelid. From the recesses of this hole, he saw 1,000 legs all roiling across each other, their movement quaking the light silk. Baby spiders. And, as he looked even closer, he saw the truth. They were eating each other. They were eating each other. And not even 6 inches away, their mother sat, unconcerned and unaware of the cannibalism of her own brood. He felt something in his heart shift. A thread of light shone through the darkness. It could all be different now. Online, you can find thousands of photos of spider sibling cannibalism, meticulously recorded images of an infant redback spider's chelicerae lovingly clasped around the carapace of its sister or brother, or a dominant female holding the frail corpse of a male in their jaws, his black eyes shining wide open as they stared at nothing. There was no regret, no identification with their prey. These spiders lived alone, ate alone, died alone. They experienced a purer form of isolation than any human hermit. It was a protective form. From birth, they understood other spiders as something to be feared, that this was the true way of things, and had been for 380 million years. Days later, he returned to the web. In that time, the surviving baby spiders had spread around the backyard. He got on all fours, not caring that his wife looked on from the back window, and found one of them in a web built between 2 blades of grass. The web was tiny. The baby spider, no larger than the head of a pin, sat in the middle awaiting a gnat or sandfly. He brought a small ring box close to the spider's web and opened it. Inside there was a shuddering movement, like a stop-motion figure jolting from place to place, a black and white blur with 8 legs and 8 eyes. A zebra jumping spider, one he'd caught earlier as it hunted on the outside of a window screen. It twisted and turned in the light until the largest of those eyes locked on the baby spider. The zebra spider launched itself at the web, its front legs wrapped around the spiderling, hauling it off the sticky thread so that its tiny legs waved helplessly in the air. Then it bit down, and the legs stopped moving. He almost smiled at this. He almost took pleasure in the success of his friend. But then he remembered. Spiders don't have friends, and spiders don't smile. There is an entire genus of spider that mimic ants. Mimorachni. They look like ants, behave like ants, and sometimes even hide within the ant colony, using them as cover. But they never forget that they are spiders. The ants are convenient tools, not friends, not allies. For their part, the ants cannot conceive of the impostor that walks among them, living a life of pure independence, completely untethered, so different from the ant colony. Nobody knew the secret that lived inside his heart. He began to set aside money. Without his wife's knowledge, he sold the car and got a lease. He remortgaged their house. He liquidated his other assets and hoarded every cent of his paycheck. All this money he routed into the dark corners of the world. He became financially untraceable. His family never noticed. He was in charge of the accounts, and they had no reason not to trust him. They still thought he was human. All the while, he played along with family dinners, movie nights, PTA meetings, sex. The perfect imposter. He did not know when he'd be ready. He just knew it would be soon. One day, he took his wife and children to a nature reserve. The trails were dark and green, even at midday. His children were old enough now that they walked ahead, exploring. He slowed his gait, waiting until his family was out of sight, around a bend in the trail. It was almost as if he was alone. He could let the mask drop. It wasn't bliss. It wasn't even comfortable. But it was safe. No human contact. No expectation. No connection to anyone but himself. Unbeknownst to him or his family, a mouse had crawled into the hubcap while they walked the woods. It became trapped between the rubber and metal. When they returned home, he saw the stiff tail poking out. The mouse was dead. The spinning of the wheel had drained all its blood to the bottom of its body, leaving a giant purple bruise. The bones had broken, disintegrated really, and it had lost its shape. It looked like a large furred grape. His children were horrified. His wife told him to throw the awful thing in the garbage as she ushered the kids inside. He said he would. But as he approached the bin, something inside him twitched to life. Something in the darkest, oldest corner of his mind. It was an ancient thing, yet still as small and frail as an infant. He looked again at the mouse. He could feel the human side of him, a roiling sea of emotions, revulsion, sadness, pity, care, a desire to fix what had happened. Then he turned to this newborn part of himself, held it up so it could look through his eyes. This part saw nothing, felt no connection. The mouse simply was. There was no barrier to what he could do with it. He squeezed the mouse in his hand until it burst. The human part of him protested and writhed, but he turned away from its weakness, turned towards this new part, and gave it control. He didn't throw up. He wasn't disgusted. He just stared. He squeezed the mess in his hand again, felt it squish between his fingers. Still nothing. It was like he was back in the forest, his wife and kids just out of sight. Alone. Safe. And he knew that meant he was finally ready. The money he'd saved was more than enough to purchase the property and the van. Then he vanished from the human world, vanished into his new life, vanished into this thing that was growing inside of him. Trapdoor spiders are ancient predators, some of the first spiders to evolve on Earth. The Heptathala genus is so old it lacks the venom that all other spiders carry. They live beneath the ground in a capped burrow, only leaving when prey wanders too close. Then they burst forth and overpower their target with dagger-like fangs. Eating. Violence. These might be the only interactions Heptathala ever has with the world beyond their trapdoor. His property was in a medium-sized city 1,000 kilometers away, one of those places that never quite recovered after the big industry left. It was on a street of mostly abandoned 2-story homes built for returning soldiers 100 years ago. He'd chosen a house on the outskirts. Behind the backyard, the ground sloped down into a deep ravine. Hundreds of acres of forest and a river that only flowed when it rained. Nobody lived back there. He opened the door and shuddered as a cold wind blew through him. Someone had shattered a rear window. The previous occupant had left a bucket full of sand with needles and cigarette butts jutting from it like spines. He never removed it. In fact, he never even bought furniture. He slept on an old mattress piled with ratty blankets. His nest. Finally, he had done it. He was alone. He was safe. No one to connect to. No one to speak to. No one to be scared of or scared for. No one to rely on or to rely on him. He had achieved pure independence, safety from the pain of others. His days were as empty as he could make them. He woke when the sun warmed his face. He ate a flavorless breakfast of meat, grain, and vegetables. Afterward, he sat on the floor and did his best to think of nothing until the next mealtime. Sometimes he was successful, and the hours flowed like clear water. Other times a thought would stick, and he would have to continually turn his face away from it. What were his children doing? Turn away. Was his wife looking for him? Turn. Were they about to discover him? Turn. Each time he turned away, he was also turning towards that ancient infant inside of him. Each time he did, it got stronger. He got stronger. He could feel his bonds falling away, piling around his feet like cut ropes. It just took practice. The only problem was food. He could only store so much in the old refrigerator and cabinets. He dreaded that moment, the moment he would have to interact with the human world. And yet a part of him was thrilled every time he left his isolation. More than anything outside, this thrill was what terrified him. Each time he went out, it was like a dam bursting. The feelings he thought he destroyed would rush to the surface upon seeing a child cry, or a happy couple, or when the cashier made a joke about stocking up for the apocalypse. After so long in blissful numbness, just feeling felt like sticking his fingers in an electrical socket. So why did he keep finding himself taking long walks in town? Why did he catch himself smiling at children? Why did he watch the TVs in the department store window? Why did he invite the pain of the world into his heart? The grocery store was perhaps the riskiest place of all. Not only was he confronted by families and individuals, every item on the shelves was a reminder of the people living throughout the world. Each box was a story. Each can had 10,000 fingerprints. And to take these items home with him, to be confronted by them every day, it was impossible. He knew he'd never be able to bear it. It would only be a matter of time before he chose to be around people again, until he was that same soft, terrified thing he'd been before. What did his instincts tell him to do? What was his way forward? How could he escape this fate? He abandoned all public places. He had everything he needed in his new home. He required nothing else. The rear of the house opened onto a ravine. His van had a large trunk. He began to hunt. The first time he killed a deer, he wept. The second time, despite himself, he felt pride. The 10th time, he felt nothing but the urgent rumble in his stomach. The deer was not anything more than food, prey. He did not connect with it any more than he connected with the wild raspberries that jutted through the chain-link fence, or the voles and pigeons he devoured when he couldn't find larger animals. His heart thudded quietly in his chest. No adrenaline pumped. None was necessary. He was clean, efficient, unafraid. He could move silently. The only sound were the squirrels that barked out warning from the trees as he passed by underneath. Occasionally, he would hear the sound of human footsteps in the woods. He would stop moving, becoming as still as the tree trunks, until the people had passed him by. If they were walking towards him, he would sprint in the other direction, all the way home. It had been months since he'd seen another person. He'd crossed a new threshold. He'd become a safer version of himself. Green turned to red, orange, and brown, and a chill permeated the air. Prey disappeared, some migrating, others hidden away in dens. A new instinct awoke. It said, "You need to plan." He sat down to think. His mind was slow and words struggled to be formed. Days later he'd put it together. He had seen the orb-weaving spiders in the woods, Erineus diadematus, Lucage venustra, and Archaeope aurantia. In mayfly season, the air was thick with wings and long shrimp-like bodies. Each web was garlanded with corpses wrapped in silk. A storage technique. The orb-weavers found safety in this act of hoarding. He gave up his solitude for 3 days in order to cart as many large freezers back to his house as possible. They filled the basement, 3 rows of white, buzzing coffins, a dozen freezers. Into them he poured carcasses of all the animals he had killed: deer, coyote, rat, pigeon, squirrel, dog, cat, everything. And as he did, the 8-eyed creature inside of him was soothed. He no longer needed for anything. He could stay inside until the food stores got low. He was safe. And yet, those 3 days in the human world had awakened a forgotten desire. He tried to stay indoors, to hide away, but it was impossible. He wanted to leave. He still yearned to be connected. It terrified him. He spent weeks laying awake on his old mattress, listening to the house creak and moan, so afraid that his breath caught in his chest. This part of him demanded connection and all the misery that came with it. It was, he realized, the most dangerous part of him, the thing that could destroy his 8-eyed self. So, he vowed to destroy it first. He began with the ropes. Structurally, the house was sound, but there were 2 large holes. One was in the kitchen ceiling. The second was just above it in the bedroom ceiling. If you stood in the kitchen and looked up, you could see right into the attic. The beams up there were sturdy old wood that smelled a bit like the forest out back. Perhaps they'd been harvested from there. He tied 2 long ropes to the attic beams so they hung all the way down into the kitchen, brushing against the dirty tile floors. Then he began to climb, up one rope hand over hand. He only made it halfway through the kitchen before his arms started shaking and his grip began to fail. He slid back down, hissing as the rope bit into his hands and thighs. Then he climbed again. Any time he thought of the outside world, he would climb. It drove the thoughts deep down, the feelings even deeper. Weeks later, he went out into the woods to hunt the soft rabbits that sometimes dug out of their burrows to find food. He had been waiting in silence for hours when he heard children and adults nearby, out snowshoeing through the drifts. He had the insane urge to run towards them, to tromp through the snow, to laugh alongside them. Somehow, he kept himself still. When he returned to his nest, he climbed up and down until he was gasping on the kitchen floor, heart pounding through his chest like a caged animal throwing itself against the bars. He was so hungry, but too weak to stand. A shadow flitted along the baseboards. His eyes flicked up to follow it. Without thinking, his hand came down hard on the centipede, crushing it, before he snapped the twitching body into his mouth and swallowed it. There was no disgust anymore. That idea had been left behind on some far shore. Prey was food. Food was life. He was not surprised by this. Surprise, disgust. These were things a human felt. He rolled over and was instantly asleep. In his gut, the centipede still twitched. He climbed the ropes for hours every day. His fingers grew hard as chitin, his arm veins thick as silk cord. His mind retreated from the ropes. There was nothing it could do in the face of such exhaustion. When he wasn't climbing, he stalked the woods. When he wasn't hunting, he slept. He acted on empty instinct. It was a peaceful time. There were no days anymore, just periods of rest and activity, darkness and light. His eyes saw only prey, or nothing at all. He didn't notice the developments outside his door. Windows were blank spaces to him. Years passed like a blur. He didn't change. He'd never changed. He was the same as he'd been for 380 million years. But the world around him was slowly transforming. The economy improved. People flowed back into this hollow city. The game meats that had been plentiful were slowly pushed out. One morning he left through the back of his property and into the woods to hunt. Movement to his right. His head snapped round. A black, brown, and white eye observed him through the fence slats. A high voice said, "Hello." He stood absolutely still until the child wandered off. Then he continued into the woods, head spinning. Fear boiled inside him, because, in that moment, he'd almost said hello back. By the time he returned home, empty-handed, he knew what had to be done. His eight-eyed self had provided the answer, as it always did. A way to separate himself for good, to keep himself safe forever. Salticus senecis, the zebra spider, is a common jumping spider found throughout North America, Europe, and North Asia. Like all jumping spiders, it is an active predator with large, forward-facing eyes. Unlike orb weavers, which hunt mainly by feel, Salticus actually sees its prey before it strikes. One of its favorite targets are other jumping spiders, genera like Atulus, Eris, and even other Salticus. Spiders with the same eyes, the same compact build, a cousin or a friend. Yet they don't see themselves in the black reflections of their prey's eyes. Or perhaps they do. The first time he ate a child was just like any other night. He'd stayed inside all day with the curtains drawn. Sunlight crept in around the edges. He lowered himself into a comfortable place and waited for dark. Had anyone looked in, they would have seen his eyes twinkling in the shadows. He'd left the house after sunset, dressed in all black. His van prowled down the roads and back alleys. The child was a young teenager living rough in a tent on the streets, still pupating, still vulnerable. He parked a block away and waited, his great, big eyes staring at the child's tent in the rear view. He made his move when the child left the tent, walking towards a nearby shelter that was serving dinner. The alleyways were quiet. Many of these buildings were still run down, their windows empty and black. He followed silently in the shadows. He didn't know when he would strike. But he didn't have to. A spider acts on instincts, and so did he. When the time came, his body was fast, his movements strong. The child weighed nothing. The man felt nothing. It was over in an instant. The child fed him for a week. Each bite numbed him further, untied the last of his bonds. He was finally free. It was an overpowering feeling. The feeling of nothing. He ate until his abdomen plumped up, then cleaned his filthy hands and face to prevent an infection. The remains went in a freezer. The rest of the freezers were filled within a week. The eight-eyed man spent most of his days crouched in the corner of a room, thinking about nothing, merely knowing that he would not be harmed, that he was safe. It was a soothing feeling, and he slept often, waking only to eat from the freezers, and to hunt, and to exercise. He knew he must exercise. He knew he could only survive as long as his body was in exceptional condition. A spider has no one else to depend on. If its body fails, then so does the spider. If he'd ever looked in a mirror, he would have seen a very different man. Gone were the kind eyes, the cheeks, the paunch, and softness of any kind. He was wiry now. His arms and legs looked twice as long, his hands twice as big. He hunted at dusk. Over the years, he discovered many ways to hunt. There were as many strategies as there were prey. He faked injuries. He faked car trouble. He hitchhiked. He found isolated bus stops. He stood in the shadows beneath bridges. He waited outside middle schools. He waited in the tall grass just off a hiking trail. He waited at the edge of the docks. He waited at the shelter. He waited for someone who might need him, someone who might show, for just a moment, that they were vulnerable. He waited, and waited, and waited. And when he finally revealed his intentions, when he finally let the mask drop, his prey would watch his arms and legs unfold and realize they were human body parts attached to something without humanity. Wide-eyed, they'd see the shadow of his hands creep along the walls and know they'd been caught by something else entirely. Then he would return home and eat his fill. The bones he would crush until they were unrecognizable and then throw away. The rest of the warm flesh would harden in the freezers. Then he would climb, up the rope and then down again. He was stronger than he'd ever been, and getting stronger every day. He'd been careful, but eventually people began to notice the disappearances. Posters were put up. Search parties were formed. Questions were asked. From time to time, a knock would come at his door. He always ignored it. One night, he went out hunting. When he returned in the early morning hours with his prey, he found junk mail in his mailbox. He always collected the mail, not to read, but so that nobody would think the house was abandoned. He threw the flyers and all the rest on the floor and began to feed. When he awoke late in the afternoon, he picked up the mail to toss it away. Something on top caught his eye. It was a missing person flyer, a teenage runaway. The photo showed him from a few angles. One was clearly a school photo. He'd used to receive one every year from his kids' school. He looked closer. The face on the flyer was familiar. It was one he'd eaten. He threw the mail across the room. The poster landed face up. He saw that child again. He rushed over and tore the poster to pieces with his strong arms and mandibles. Each piece of fluttering confetti contained a piece of that child. There was his cheek, his arm, his brow, his ear. The eight-eyed man howled and grasped at the shards of paper, stuffing them into his mouth, eating what had already been eaten. And as he did, he remembered his family for the first time in years. He bolted from the room and grasped the silk cords. He hoisted himself into the air, trying to escape the threat. Hand over hand he climbed, but far too fast, and he was too full of raw meat and paper and ink. At the top of the rope, his head began to spin. He retched on his shoulder. Then his grip failed, and he fell onto the kitchen tiles, shattering them and his leg. He lay there in agony for a long time, and was thankful when his vision went black. The broken leg was a gift. Any unwanted thoughts could be swept away by simply digging the butt of his hunting knife into the flesh near the break. It was bliss. The pain was an afterthought. One after another, his wounds became infected. He developed a hacking cough. In that weakened state, he was forced to stay inside and feed on what he'd collected in his freezers. Months passed. His leg was healing crooked, and the cough had only gotten worse. His food stores were empty, and he hadn't eaten in days. He was seeing things, hearing things. For the first time, staying still and quiet was no longer the safe option. There was no choice. He had to go out hunting. The daylight dazzled him. He'd thought it was dusk. He dragged his leg into the street and along the sidewalk. His local hunting grounds weren't far. The main street. It had never failed him. He turned the corner and saw a child. His hunger was enormous, blinding. He reached out with a strong hand and wrenched the child towards him. They screamed for help. But unlike so many other times, someone was around to hear it. In the corner of his eye, he saw two figures rushing towards him. He let go of the child, took a stumbling step backwards and turned to walk away. He heard the humans comforting their young, heard the tearful explanation. He looked over his shoulder. The father and mother stared back at him, meeting his eyes. He looked away and staggered forward, walking and then running as best he could on his dying leg, doubled over, not even seeing the path ahead, just hoping that he could find some place to escape to, some place safe. He needed darkness. He needed isolation. He turned down street after street until he found one filled with abandoned houses. He tucked himself under a damaged porch and waited for dusk. Despite the gnawing hunger in his guts, sleep came quickly. It was pitch black when he awoke. His leg was in searing pain. His head pounded. When he sat up, his body shuddered with wet coughs that echoed up and down the empty street. It wouldn't stop. He could barely take a breath before the next cough shook his lungs like a jar of pennies. He pulled himself along the ground, thinking only of how he could hunt in this state. And then, there were two hands on his shoulders. He twisted under their touch, trying to get away. He rolled onto his back. A woman stood over him. She reached down again, grasping his hands to help him to his feet. She was speaking. "It's okay," she said. "Come on, let me help you." He knew those words. He remembered them. He feared them, hated them, wanted to escape them. But he was too weak. All he could do was cough and try to ignore her. Eventually, he stood up. The woman took him into her home and forced him to sit at her kitchen table, forced him to drink water. He did. Slowly, the coughing ceased. He sat there in that kitchen, accepting her help, speaking the few words he could still speak. She asked if there was anyone she could call, and his mind briefly flashed to his family, the family he'd once lived alongside in a home not unlike this one. He shook his head, no. Being in this place, being near this woman, it was torture. Each glance exchanged, each sentence spoken, each moment together was a thread that retied him to his humanity. Years of work undone in minutes. He no longer felt alone. It terrified him. It took everything in his power not to run back into the night. He couldn't. Not yet. He still needed to feed, and she was alone. He was weak, but still large, still a predator. She walked over to refill his glass. When she turned her back on him, he would strike. He braced his feet against the floor, tensed his legs, and felt their readiness. The Portia genus of spiders almost exclusively stalk, kill, and eat other spiders. They have as many hunting strategies as they have prey. They mimic leaf litter to ambush jumping spiders. They vibrate orb webs to mimic trapped insects. They attack spitting spiders from the rear. They even use feints to drive prey out of hiding. To develop these strategies, Portia spiders study spider behavior. They watch how their prey moves, investigate their choices, learn about their bodies, their homes, their lives. And then they eat them. She poured him more water and, in the same movement, pushed an ice pick straight through his neck. He spasmed in his chair, caught between leaping onto her and trying to flee. Her hand came down on his shoulder like an iron weight, and for the first time, he realized how strong she was. She held him in place as he struggled, as the strength drained out of him. His vision started to fade. His eyelids fluttered. His hand found her arm. At his touch, she looked down. She stared into his eyes, blankly, and he knew she could see all 8 of them, just as he could see all 8 of hers. The first time he'd ever truly been seen. And in that moment, he knew he was finally safe. The Wrong Station is made possible with the generous support of our listeners on Patreon. Visit today at patreon.com/thewrongstation. You can also support us by leaving a rating and review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever it is you tune into the show. This week's episode, 8 Eyes, was written by Jacob Duarte Spiel and performed by Anthony Botello. Thank you to Davbar, Absurd Deity, Howie, Matthew McCullough, Now and Zen, Acalia, Marlo Gabrielle Leahy, Trey Gibbons, Devlin Vlietstra, and Marvin, just Marvin, for helping us keep the lights, well, off. The Wrong Station is co-produced by Alexander Saxton, Anthony Botello, and Jacob Duarte Spiel, with music composed and performed by Alon Citron and arranged for the viola and performed by Viola Schmidt. You can follow The Wrong Station on social media at The Wrong Station and email us at thewrongstation@gmail.com. And until next time, thank you for listening.